activities. So effects of aging without exercise. Let's look at that. We get muscle atrophy. Again, people that don't do exercise training, their muscles will start becoming smaller. Those muscle fibers will start shrinking. I don't know about you, but I remember when I first started lifting weights in the 1980s, all the way back then when I was in high school, a woman I dated at the time, a girl I dated at the time, well, if you stop lifting weights, all that muscle is going to turn to fat. No. Muscle and fat are two different types of tissue. Muscle are contractile proteins of actin and myosin. Fat is adipose tissue, stored energy. They're two different types of tissue. However, if you stop exercise, muscle will atrophy and the body will store more and more fat. So it does look like muscle turns to fat. But without exercise, people over the age of 30 can start losing up to 10% of muscle mass per year without exercise. Inelastic collagen, so soft tissue models along the lines of stress. That's Davis's law. Fibroblasts can either form muscle fibers or, satellite cells become fibroblasts. Fibroblasts can either become muscle fibers or collagen. If people stay seated all the time and the layers of muscle are pressed together, the collagen will bind down between those layers and create adhesions, so the muscle layers won't slide against each other effectively. Muscle adhesions restrict joint range of motion. That's why when you see older adults, they're stuck in that hunched over position and they can't stand up all the way. They have all that collagen bound down that's restricting their mobility. If people don't exercise, they reduce nerve conductivity. They get a loss of balance. They get limited movement. They get reduced proprioception. Proprioception is that input coming in from the environment. All these things happen without aging. Muscle force production goes down. Now, here's the thing. Research shows, again, looking at the research suggests that strength training, you can lose as little as 2% muscle mass per decade. We're going to lose muscle mass as we get older for a variety of reasons. We just don't produce it, for a variety of reasons. However, with strength training, we can slow down that loss of muscle mass. So over the age of 30, people can lose up to 10% of muscle mass per decade. With strength training, we can lower that number down to 2% per decade. Now, here's the thing. Andropause is a real thing. Over the age of 35, men can produce less testosterone. That is for real. I don't know if you've seen in the United States, we have these commercials, and when we had sports on TV, we have all these commercials for low testosterone, low T, low testosterone. That's natural. The men will start producing less testosterone without strength training. But here's the cool thing. Strength training at any age, 50s, 60s, 70s, strength training can increase levels of testosterone, both free testosterone and testosterone that works directly on muscle fibers. So really, that's where we can have a huge impact on this by helping people train differently. Over the age of 40, there's a loss of explosive strength or power. And that comes down to type 2 muscle fibers. Here's the thing about muscle fibers in the body. If you don't use them, you'll lose them. You'll lose the innervation, the type 2 motor units. So type 2 motor units activate type 2 muscle fibers. Think about it. A lot of times people in their 50s and 60s, they might exercise, but they don't do a lot of heavy strength training, and they do very little explosive strength training. People in their 50s, 60s, and 70s should still be doing explosive strength training. But instead of doing the Olympic lift where they do a clean and jerk, and I'm going to bring up my video here for a second. People in their 50s, 60s should be throwing medicine balls. They can do medicine ball throws. They can do different directions of medicine ball throws. If they use the Viper, if you know what the Viper is, that's a rubber tube about 1 meter long. A Viper is a combination. I love a Viper because a Viper is kind of a combination of a medicine ball and a barbell. So a Viper, you can do explosive push jerk releases. With a Viper, you can do snatch throws where you do the snatch pattern and release it in the air. So there are a lot of different exercises that you can have people in their 50s and 60s do that don't require barbell training. Because would I take someone in their 60s and have them do the Olympic lifts, like do a clean and jerk and do a snatch? Now, if they've been doing Olympic weightlifting their whole entire life, sure, but we would just lower the volume and lower that intensity. But somebody in their 60s, I wouldn't necessarily teach them Olympic lifts. However, I'd feel comfortable teaching them throws, medicine ball throws. I'd feel comfortable teaching them plyometric jumps. They don't need to do a 48-inch box jump or death jump to do that. Just jumping in place or skipping, doing some type of explosive activity would be completely appropriate. So just because they get older doesn't mean they shouldn't train with intensity. People in their 50s and 60s should be doing power training. People in their 70s should be doing power training. There's been a lot of research to suggest that power training may actually be more beneficial than strength training for people in their 60s and 70s, because you're getting faster nerve conductivity. You're activating more of the type 2 motor units, and you get better speed of movement. You get better reaction, better reflexes. So it's not where we start. Keep in mind, when I say that people in their 60s and 70s should be doing this, that doesn't mean the first day of a strength training program or the first time they exercise, I take them over to that box, or I give them a 5 kg or 4 kg med ball. Not at all. We still need to go through progressive training to get them there. But however, if I'm going to be working with somebody in their 60s and 70s, I'm going to be progressing them to doing medicine ball throws. I'm not going to let them regress to doing chair aerobics with paper plates. I'm going to keep making that. I can't stand seeing that. I teach at a local YMCA, and it always makes me cry a little when I see, when I see the classes, when I see the older adults, doing the chair aerobics. I mean, some exercise is better than nothing, but people in their 70s, if you're functional and you're ambulatory, they should be doing those agility drills. Again, walking, not sprinting, but teaching their full entire body. So exercise goals. What do we want to do? We want to do appropriate stress, mechanical overload, use heavier loads. Mechanical overload damages the structure of the muscle fibers. Metabolic overload fatigues the glycogen stored in muscle fibers. Both those types of overload can lead to muscle growth. So we want to induce that overload. We want to increase levels of anabolic hormones. When we look at muscle, this is structural muscle. We have two different types of components of muscle. We have the contractile element, and then we have which is actin myosin, and we have the non-contractile, which is the fascia and the elastic tissue. Around every single individual muscle fiber is a layer of fascia. The muscle fiber, the actin myosin, when they contract, if you take your fingers and you do this, the cross bridging, when actin myosin contract, they create force, they generate force. It's that elastic fascia that transmits force between all the different muscles. Now, what they found about fascia, studying fascia the last number of years, is fascia has 10 times more nerve endings than muscle fibers. So fascia has become, this is where we've started to be understanding fascia a lot more, is that fascia, it used to be, muscle, we look at muscle, contract, 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 but fascia has a lot more sensory nerve endings than muscle, 10 times more afferent nerve endings. Afferent are the sensory endings, efferent are the motor responses. So fascia, when we move in multiple planes of motion, the fascia is probably your primary proprioceptor because it's feeling that lengthening. Now, here's the difference between muscle and fascia. In order to get muscle stronger, in order to get the actin myosin, these are the actin myosin cross bridges. When you get that shortening, when you get the cross bridges, that shortening is what generates the muscle force. And it's the fascia on every single muscle fiber that dissipates force to the body. In order to make muscle, the contractile element, stronger, you need to contract against an external resistance. So muscle becomes stronger by contracting against an external resistance. Fascia, connective tissue, becomes stronger by lengthening against resistance. So if we want to make fascia stronger, we have to lengthen under resistance. We can move in multiple planes of motion. That's where we take a light load, like a 2 or 3 kg medicine ball, or maybe a 3 kg Viper, and we move in multiple planes of motion. I think actually Viper goes down to 4 kg. Yeah, Viper starts at 4 kg and moves up from there. But we move in multiple planes of motion. We grab sandbells. We use different types of weights, but we move in multiple planes because we're training the fascia. We're training the lengthening under resistance. When we do heavy strength training, for contractile element, we have to load up. We can only go in one plane of motion. Strength training, we're pretty much going linear against the force of gravity. When we do fascial training, we strengthen connective tissue. We want to move resistance through gravity. So there's a difference there. All right, time to share the screen again. Here we go. Bang. Mechanotransduction is a fancy term that mechanical force in the body creates chemical change. So mechanical force into muscle cells, mechanical force against the fascia, against both muscle and fascia, creates a satellite cell response. Satellite cells become fibroblasts. Satellite cells will model new muscle fibers. So satellite cells can help repair the damaged actin myosin proteins. Fibroblasts can also help repair damaged collagen. By lengthening under resistance, you're actually adding more collagen to the tissue, making the tissue more resilient. But that comes down to the term mechanotransduction. Mechanotransduction means mechanical force creates a chemical change in the body. Fascial fitness, when we look at what fascial does, it provides structure to bundles of muscle fibers. It transfers force. It maintains tension in the body. It provides sensory input and feedback about where your body is in space. Fascia also supplies, it helps metabolize nutrients, and it transfers fluid and energy into the tissues, into the muscle tissue. That's a great quote from Thomas Myers. Fascia is strengthened by a wide variety of vectors in angle, tempo, and load. Now, one of the things I do is I host a podcast called All About Fitness. I've interviewed Myers for All About Fitness, and it was great, fascinating conversation about how to train fascia. I've interviewed Rodney Korn about that, Sue Hitzman, Emily Splickle, Dr. Splickle. I've had conversations with all of them about how to train the fascial structures and the fascial systems. The importance of fascia. It's a great quote from Robert Schleip's book, Fascia. When we look at it, it can create a more youthful architecture. And the research shows that over 2 years, with 2 years of proper loading, 2 years of proper training, you can create a more youthful, more resilient, more elastic fascial architecture. Think about Tai Chi, yoga, dance, different types of martial arts. That really is, you get the better response from the fascial system. So up to 40% of force is generated from the mechanical efforts of fascia. We always think of muscle being that contractile element of generating force. But that's one of the benefits of doing explosive training. Kettlebell training, doing that quick swings. These are swings, you're lengthening and shortening the fascia. Here's the thing about plyometric training. Plyometric training, really, when you look at it, plyometric training, when you do a plyometric, the muscle fiber stays under contraction, but the fascia around the muscle fiber is what's rapidly lengthening and shortening. So think about that. If you're doing a plyometric activity, if I'm doing a plyometric activity, quickly doing that activity, the muscle fiber stays under tension. So that muscle fiber is performing an isometric contraction. It's the fascia around the muscle fibers that's rapidly lengthening and shortening. That's one of the reasons why it's important to do explosive training for older adults, is we make them more resilient. We make a more elastic fascial architecture. That isometric muscle, that isometric fiber stays contracted, the connective tissue around it lengthens and shortens. So that's, just something to pay attention to. Really understand. For years I would say that, I used to teach for a certification organization group, that I would say for plyometric training, the muscle fibers lengthen and shorten. That's a little bit inaccurate. The muscle fibers remain contracted. It's the connective tissue around it that lengthens and shortens. A little bit more information on fascia there. You don't need me to read the slide to you. You can see what's there. So what do we need to do? I've already mentioned this. Exercise for fascia, we move in multiple planes of motion. What we call loaded movement training is movement. I got that from Michelle Dalcourt in the Institute of Motion. Loaded movement training is where we move an object through space. Think about what people do at home. They pick up something from the floor, they put it on a shelf. They pick up something from a shelf, they carry it somewhere. What do we do in the gym? In the gym, we pick something up, we go up and down with it, and then we put it right back where we got it. If we want to make people truly strong, we have to teach them how to move a load through space, not just lift the load up and down against gravity. So exercise for fascia, we want to move through multiple planes of motion. Exercise for muscle, for the contractile element, we want heavy load going in a single plane of motion. The pictures on the left side of the screen, fascial, we're training fascia. Pictures on the right side of the screen, ideally training contractile element. And you'll see how that comes in a little bit later. Benefits of strength and power training. Again, this is for everybody. And again, the research shows that older adults, 60s, 70s, in their 60s and 70s, have these same outcomes. We just go at a slower progression and we go to lower volume. We don't need to do a high volume. We don't need to crush them. Adding one set of power training, adding a couple reps of power training is where we can start and build from there. So these are all the benefits. We get muscular development. By doing strength training, we reduce sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is a loss of muscle mass. We activate the type 2 muscle motor units. The T2 units, it's not a term reference to Terminator, but we get neural adaptations. We activate the type 2 motor units. That's why power training is important. Because if people are only doing light resistance, well, I'm old, I can only do light resistance. Heavy resistance, explosive training activates the type 2 muscle fibers. Type 2 muscle fibers have a different motor unit, the type 2 motor unit. Type 2 muscle fibers use different enzymes. Doing light resistance, 15, 20 repetitions, they become more aerobically efficient, utilizing free fatty acids and oxygen for fuel. Heavier resistance training at higher intensities, is going to be using glycolysis, both aerobic and anaerobic glycolysis. So break down a carbohydrate using heavier exercise, using heavier loads, or we maintain free fatty acid oxidation with lighter loads. Just different activation, different physiology from the muscle. When we look at, we delay fatigue. We get a terrific testosterone and growth hormone response, more satellite cell production, the catecholamines of epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. You know, there's a reason why there's that runner's high. Dopamine and serotonin are those neurotransmitters that make us feel good. You know, exercise can elevate levels of dopamine and serotonin. For older adults that are at risk of isolation, developing depression, that's where challenging them to work a little bit harder can elevate those levels of dopamine, can elevate levels of serotonin. Really pretty fascinating stuff, bringing everything full circle. These are different, the endocrine response to exercise. Cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. When our body is under stress, if you're under stress at work, you'll get a cortisol dump. If you're under stress at exercise, and exercise is stress, what cortisol does is mobilize free fatty acids. FFAs are free fatty acids. It blocks glucose going into the cells. It's going to allow free fatty acid oxidation for energy. This is why, if you've ever wondered why fasted cardio works, if you go to the gym first thing in the morning, you go to exercise first thing in the morning, and you do aerobic, not high intensity training, you do low intensity aerobic training, in the morning, your body produces more cortisol to get you waking up and get you moving. You'll be metabolizing and using more free fatty acids for fuel first thing in the morning if you stay at the lower intensity, because they'll block glucose going into the cells. Now, here's the thing. It also inhibits protein synthesis. Cortisol, for people that exercise too long, for people that exercise for more than 50 or 60 minutes at a high intensity, and they start running out of muscle glycogen, they start running out of carbohydrate, cortisol can convert amino acids or protein into carbohydrate through a process called gluconeogenesis. That's why stuff like Gatorade and sports drinks were invented. That keeps carbohydrate in the system during prolonged exercise. So cortisol is our friend because it can help burn fat. It can help burn fat as a fuel. But too much cortisol is not our friend because now we'll be burning protein for fuel. And cortisol is also produced by stress. Just understand that it's a very powerful hormone. Growth hormone. Now, for women, growth hormone has a much larger effect on women than testosterone. And I'll go into that in a second. Growth hormone is a peptide hormone. That means it works on the nucleus of the cell membrane. It works on not the nucleus. Peptide hormone works on the cell membrane. So it works on the outside of the cell. Growth hormone promotes uptake of amino acids. Amino acids are used to repair damaged muscle fibers. Growth hormone is used in lipolysis, the breakdown of fat. Fatty acid oxidation is also called lipolysis, the breakdown of fat, free fatty acids into ATP. So growth hormone can promote that. Growth hormone can also fight against gluconeogenesis. It can fight against that. So we maintain protein to use protein to repair muscle fibers and tissues. Growth hormone is produced by strength training. Now, this is especially important for women in their 40s and 50s and beyond. Their body will produce more growth hormone in response to strength training. That means their body will become more efficient at burning fat for fuel. They'll add more lean muscle mass. Growth hormone is important. It's important to understand that growth hormone is produced during the REM cycles of sleep. So if you get tired, that's where sleep becomes very critical. And I'll go into that in a little bit later. Growth hormone is produced by both mechanical overload is heavier load. Metabolic overload is load going to fatigue. So if you do a heavier load, you're creating damage to the structures of muscle fibers. That's mechanical overload. A heavier load is damage to the structures of muscle fibers. A heavier load is damage to the structure of the muscle fibers, and that's called mechanical overload. Working to a point of fatigue, you deplete muscle glycogen. That's called metabolic overload. Both happen. So growth hormone is a very powerful anabolic hormone. Growth factors are very powerful anabolic hormones. Muscle fibers themselves, muscle cells and liver promote the growth factor. The most common one is insulin-like growth factor. They work with growth hormone to help repair the muscle tissue. Growth factor, IGF, insulin-like growth factor, is called insulin-like because after exercise, if you take carbohydrate, it'll elevate levels of insulin. It also elevate levels of insulin-like growth factor, behaves like insulin. That's why the research suggests taking a carbohydrate and protein drink after exercise can help muscle repair and muscle recovery. you're elevating levels of insulin-like growth factor. Testosterone, most popular anabolic steroid. Now, here's the thing. Testosterone is produced in the male testes. So men produce significantly more amounts of testosterone than women. Women will produce testosterone in the thecal cells of the ovary. It's also produced a little bit from the hypothalamus pituitary axis, but primarily in men, testosterone is produced in the testes. That's why women will not blow up. Women won't lift 2 sets of weights and blow up with large muscles overnight. That just physiologically, unless they're taking extra, does not happen. Testosterone is a steroid hormone. Anabolic means growth. Steroid means a hormone that works on the nucleus of the cell. So testosterone is a very powerful anabolic steroid that everybody produces. It's produced in response to mechanical stress. So heavier loads, whereas working to fatigue can elevate levels of growth hormone and growth factor, working with heavier loads can elevate levels of testosterone. And men in their 60s, 70s, and beyond can still produce testosterone in response to strength training. So, and that's if you work with men in their 40s and 50s and they're starting to fight that low T, it's a real thing. Starting to do strength training can help do that. Now, here's another thing. There's an enzyme called aromatase. Men that have a lot of excess body fat, I'm gonna pull this up here for a second. Men that have excess body fat, adipose tissue, body fat will take testosterone and aromatase is an enzyme produced by fat that will convert testosterone to a hormone called estradiol. Estradiol is what produces breast growth in women. So listen to that again. Men that have a lot of abdominal fat will produce an enzyme called aromatase. Aromatase convert testosterone, what testosterone in the body does produce, into estradiol. Estradiol is a hormone that promotes the growth of breasts. That's why a lot of men that have really round bellies, have a lot of belly fat, also have breasts. Is their belly fat is converting testosterone into the hormone that grows breasts. One of the first things, if you're working with men in that age demographic that have excessive abdominal fat, we need to get them to increase their physical activity so they can get rid of that. So we can get them into an anabolic, we can break down that body fat and so you start conserving their testosterone for doing muscle building. So that's why I wanted just to bring that up, is to be able to make that big point. So for people that have a lot of abdominal fat, for men that have a lot of abdominal fat, the abdominal fat will work against them and convert testosterone into the hormone that grows breasts.